Next up on the industry stage, Tom Hopkinson from ROEST.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So, my name's Tom, and I work for ROEST. I'm the head of coffee and customer success. And in my role here, I speak to a lot of different people about their sample roasting, about the struggles they have with sample roasting, about the kind of roasting that they're doing. And so what I want to do in this talk is share a little bit about people's different approaches to sample roasting, the different challenges they have. And then from that, give an idea of what I think is coming in the future and how I see the role of sample roasting and the way that we do sample roasting changing. But first, I just want to give a little bit of a recap of how we got to this point. So ROEST as a company was founded around 10 years ago, but I've been saying 10 years ago for at least 2 or 3 years now, so 10 and a bit years ago. And in that time, quite a lot has changed. So when Trond and Sverre, who founded the company, first started thinking about building a sample roaster, the default was this kind of roaster we see on the left. So the kind of classic drum, it's just a metal drum directly over a heat source with a hole in the front, and you stand there with a teaspoon to keep an eye on how the beans are progressing, and then when the roast is brown enough, you lift the whole drum up, dump it out into the cooling tray, and that's it. And this is a very, very manual process. It's something that takes a bit of skill to get consistent results, and it's time-consuming and it's slow. And if you want to speed up, your only option is to run several of these roasters side by side. And if you've been to the big coffee traders, you'll see people with 8 of these barrels side by side in a single machine as a way to try and get enough samples roasted. And that's something that takes a lot of skill and a lot of attention from somebody. And so when we started designing a sample roaster, this was really the problem that we set out to solve through automation. And so the first step was to build a sample roaster that can just do that for you. And we're not the only ones who saw this, and there's some other examples here. But by automating it, you free up that time so that instead of spending all that time standing there with a teaspoon, you can be spending your time with a cupping spoon instead. And that was the idea. And so that's where we started. And then what we found is with the roaster that we built, more and more of our customers were really interested in the data that they were getting from that machine. And so we started expanding what that data consisted of. So we launched the L100, which is for labs. And this is the idea of this is you're moving from it being a sample roaster to it being a lab analysis tool by looking at not just the temperature of the beans, but also the temperature of the environment, the temperature of the machine itself, and collecting more information about that roasting environment that lets you understand a bit more about what's happening to your coffee. And this kind of started us on a road that we've carried on to this day. We've just kept on adding sensors. So like our newest production roaster, the P3000, we have more than 15 temperature sensors. We're measuring the airflow by volume. We're measuring the pressure. We're collecting visual data from a camera. So what we found, like our approach, is that we just get more and more and more data, and people are hungry for more. And that's the direction we've taken. And then with that data, one of the things that this allows you to do is to build what we call adaptive profiles. And the idea of this is taking a little step beyond automation. So instead of just running on a fixed profile, you can build a profile that will adjust to the coffee that you've put in the machine. And this is really, really important in sample roasting, particularly because you have hundreds and hundreds of completely different coffees that you only get to roast once, and you don't know how they're going to behave in the roaster. So this is where there's still a very manual process, is like somebody needs to keep an eye on the roast and make sure that this highly processed, or in other way, or this Pacamara or this tiny mocha is getting the treatment that it needs. But if you can build a profile that will adapt to those beans, then you take away even more of the manual step. And there's different approaches to this. But I will talk a bit more about these a little later on. Okay. So I want to talk about what I think the big challenges are right now in sample roasting that we're still facing. And of course, one of the challenges is green quality, as you can see from these lovely examples in Kenya. But really, like, even now, even with a skilled roaster, even with the best tools, there is still inconsistency because you're dealing with different material all of the time. And like any of you that have done this kind of cupping, you'll have had that experience where you have to try and somehow taste past the sample roast to understand what the coffee tastes like if you didn't mess up the roast. You know, like I've done it, we've all done it. And the results of sample roasting can be pretty unpredictable. You know, you've got this varied raw material, you don't know what it's going to do when you put it in the roaster, and you only get one shot. So if you miss first crack, that's it. You've just got to deal with it. And it takes a lot of time. Even with the automation, sample roasting is something that takes time out of your day, but if you take too long to do it, then it's gone. And a roaster friend of mine described putting a cupping table out recently where by the time they got around to tasting it, only one of the coffees was still available. And at that point, you then have to kind of question, what is the role of sample roasting in this decision-making process? There's only one coffee to choose. But I'm going to come back to that point. And then the thing that I think we really struggle with in sample roasting is that it's really important. Like, making good buying decisions is make or break for your coffee business. Like, we all know this. But it doesn't generate any immediate value. It's only generating value in the future. So it's very easy to put the sample roasting off. There's always something more important or more urgent right now. But if you put it off too long, then the coffee is gone. So finding that balance, finding the time to making the space to do it is a big challenge. And then all of these challenges are compounded by what is happening in the coffee world more generally. And you'll hear about this a lot this weekend, so I won't go into too much. But you know, the situation we're in with record high pricing, the effects of climate change and extreme weather events, and the changes in the market generally do also have an impact for sample roasting as well. And all of these things together mean that making a mistake is becoming more and more expensive. If you've bought a coffee that turns out not to be the coffee you were hoping for, or if you miss out on the coffee that was going to really like seal your lineup, it's more expensive to make that mistake than it used to be. And so just to dig into those a little bit more, talked about pricing. Probably if you're here on the industry stage, you already know that coffee prices are much higher than they were. And it's been a huge challenge for a lot of people. And that means that that buying decision is much riskier than it used to be. And this honestly looks set to continue. You know, coffee stocks have dropped for 5 years in a row now. Demand is growing, supply is not keeping up. And then the trading conditions are volatile. You know, you get tariffs one day and not the next. Shipping is unpredictable. And so it means as a buyer, you have to react faster. There's less coffee available. You have to make decisions very quickly. And when the price is high, you really need to know that the coffee is going to justify that price. And then anecdotally, we've seen that when prices are high, more and more people are finding that the coffee that arrives is maybe not exactly the coffee they were hoping for. You know, whether it was shipped in a way that was less than ideal, or it wasn't packed properly because it was being rushed out, or maybe something was promised and then somebody else came in with an offer. It's hard to say, but consistent sample roasting and solid data that you can point to is really important to be able to go back to your supplier and say, this is not the coffee that we discussed. And if your sample roast has that data, then you can back that decision up. You can back that assertion up much more clearly. Okay, and then with climate change, with extreme weather, this is obviously contributing to the lack of coffee, but it also means that the kinds of coffee that we're roasting are changing. So we're seeing more hybrids, we're seeing more people experimenting with different varieties and species of coffee, and these roast differently. And then, of course, processing, drying practices, those are changing as the climate changes and as non-traditional producing countries take up some of the slack from the classic countries that we used to buy from. And then the extreme weather events means that the lots that you're buying are more variable than they used to be. like even within a single lot, you might see more variation. And this means that roasting is just a bit less predictable than it used to be, and you need tools to keep up with that. And then when I talk about the changing market, there's a few things here that I think link to the way that we roast in sample roasting. And one of them is that there's a kind of split I'm finding in specialty between what you might call kind of low specialty and high specialty. And at one end, at the commercial end of specialty, you've got consolidation, you've got commercialization, you've got the big companies moving in and realizing that consumers value quality, and you've got people launching big chains. And then maybe as a response to that, at the other end, you've got this kind of hyper-specialization. You've got people setting up tiny little cafe nano-roasteries to serve a very small community and doing it by themselves. And this is one example here. This is called Iskra. He's just started in Berlin. He has 3 tables, 2 espresso machines, 4 grinders, and a roast L100 on the back bar. So he's serving a very, very small number of people, but really like focused on creating a unique experience. And if you've got these kind of companies coming into the market, all of those need to make buying decisions. They all need samples, but there's a limited amount of sample material every time you buy a lot. So if you've got 100 roasters competing for the same lot of coffee, not all of them are going to get to taste it. So there's pressure on sample material as well. And then for a company like this, he's by himself. He needs to think very carefully about how he uses his labor time, about his margins. And then the other thing that's changing is this, the fashion for heavily process-driven coffee. Now, I'm hoping, maybe a few people around here are hoping that some of this is a fad, but some of these new, some of these processing methods are going to shake out and become part of the landscape. And those do need different approaches in roasting. And I just want to give one example of that. So this is some samples I roasted just the other day from Sucafina. And there's 4 roasts here. And you can see 3 of them came out virtually identical with the same profile. And then the 4th one was a cold-washed Bourbon, which I didn't expect to be particularly weird. But you can see, like, looking at the rate of rise curve, it seems like it hit first crack around the same time as the other coffees. But the beans didn't start popping until nearly 40 seconds later, which is a challenge, because now I'm thinking, okay, which of these events is actually first crack? Is it when the beans are popping, or is it when the rate of rise starts dropping? And how do I decide when to end the roast in that situation? So I had to make that call manually, and I would have loved it if we had some automation that could help us with that process. I'm just going to highlight what the difference is. So you can see here we've got the bean temperature curve and the rate of rise. Those should look familiar. And then down in the bottom right corner, that line creeping up is the number of cracks. So if you haven't seen this before, this is from our first crack detection. It counts how many times the beans crack. And you can see 3 coffees all started at the same time, all cracked around the same number of times. And then this cold washed, nothing, 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 and then only started cracking much later in the process. And this is just something that we are going to need to adapt to more and more often. OK, and then to give one more example of the kind of hyper-specialization I'm talking about, I wanted to I went to talk to Kata. So Kata, you guys might already know, she's an importer based in Bogota, in Colombia, and she and her company have made a name by finding producers that are doing new and interesting processing, but maybe haven't reached the wider market yet. And she goes and identifies those producers, brings them to a wider market. And now she's launched a new kind of program within that called Kata Elite. And this is a program focused on finding competition lots specifically. So she's going to the producers she works with, and she's tasting coffees out of the tank, off the drying table, and trying to identify lots with extraordinary potential long before they are reaching the mill. And to do that takes an incredible amount of QC work. She's tasting those coffees at a lot of different stages in the process, and all of those, every time you taste the coffee, it has to be sample roasted. And then once the coffee is milled, she describes that they cup it multiple times in different locations to make sure that the coffee still stands out, however your cupping protocol varies. And so she's doing a lot more sample roasting in order to bring these kind of lots to market. And that's an enormous amount of work. And so she says, like, it's absolutely crucial for her that she can design a profile and then let other members of her team actually do the work of roasting, because there's so much more than there used to be. And when you're working with this kind of coffee, making the wrong decision is costly. And she talks about their mission is to reveal, to like discover and reveal the work of producers. They're not making the coffee, but they're finding the good stuff, and then they're helping producers bring it to market. And if you make that mistake, that can be a life-changing moment for a producer. If you miss buying the coffee that was going to be the one, that was going to take somebody to the world, that can really affect a producer. And she says, imagine if Sub Pop hadn't signed Nirvana because their sound system had a bad EQ. And in this case, the sample roaster is just the tool that lets you discover what is there. So this is the background. And what does all this mean for sample roasters? And I guess my thesis is that sample roasting is moving away from being just a kind of gatekeeping of quality and towards a broader tool for decision making. And when I started looking into this, I talked to friends and customers about how they sample roast and how they see that changing. And one of the people I spoke to was Lucia Solis and her partner Nick Hafner. So if you don't know Lucia, she is a coffee fermentation specialist. So she goes out and consults with producers all around the world on how they ferment their coffee, how to get better and more consistent results. But she also produces coffee on a farm in Guatemala. And Nick is the one who does all the sample roasting for them. And of course, when you are really focused on process, there is, again, a lot of tasting. You need a very quick feedback loop to make sure that you're making the right decisions. And what Nick says is that he's found more and more, he's no longer thinking about what roast will bring the best flavor, which sounds strange, but it's actually, he doesn't need the coffee to taste its best. He needs to find the flaws. He needs to know, does the coffee work in this situation, or how is the processing affecting the roasting? So when he's sample roasting for purpose. And you'll hear people talk about cupping for purpose, the idea that cupping is not the only or the best tool for measuring coffee quality, that there are some situations where cupping helps, and there are other situations where the other decision making is actually a better idea. And it's the same with sample roasting. And if you are sample roasting only to make the coffee taste as good as it can, you're not necessarily getting the information that you need. And so for him, better decision making is much more important than better roasting. And I found that interesting. And for him and for a lot of our customers as well, there's been this shift away from having very specific profiles for every single coffee towards using one broad profile, maybe an adaptive profile that can adjust a little bit to the coffee, but one profile for 70, 80, 90, 100% of your roasts. And first of all, that's much easier. If you only have one profile to handle, you don't have to think about which one you're using. But the less input I make, the less chances there are for me to make a mistake. And if I use consistent inputs on every roast, then what happens in that roast is only the coffee. If I see the coffee behaving weirdly, I know that's not because I messed it up, but it's because this is how the coffee behaves. And so for me, this idea of like using one consistent input is becoming more and more important. And we're seeing a lot of customers move towards this and away from the big like libraries of profiles, my mid-sized washed Honduras profile from people are moving more and more towards having one single profile and using the data instead. Okay, so adaptive profiling, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I want to explain what I mean by this. And the idea is that we are using data and all the complexity that we have in the machines to try and make the job of roasting as simple as possible. And there's different ways to do this, and the first tool that we developed for this was the first crack detection. So the idea is that the machine can hear when the beans are popping, it will mark first crack for you, and then based on when first crack hits, it'll decide when to end the roast. And so if you're roasting a big, dense, wet bean, needs a lot more energy to reach a good level of development. But if the machine hears that first crack is later, then it can respond. It can roast a little bit longer to make sure that coffee still gets developed. And then if the next thing you throw in is something small, it roasts quickly. First crack arrives early, and the machine will cut the roast off early so that you're still getting a good level of development. And this is something that we use all the time. And from that, we then moved into what we call BTIT, which is a bean temperature-based profile. So instead of your profile saying, OK, charge at this temperature, at 1 minute do this, at 2 minutes do this, we're now saying, OK, charge at this temperature, wait till the beans reach 150, and then increase the heat. And then at 190, as the beans are approaching first crack, now we can reduce the heat again. And that means if your beans take longer to heat up, the profile will stretch to accommodate it. And so this is the kind of thing we're talking about when I say adaptive profiling. But there's other examples as well. And I think in the future, we can develop, or someone can develop tools to make this even more powerful. Because first crack is only one marker of how the roast is going. And from the example I showed you earlier, first crack is variable. It's not completely consistent. So what I am interested in over the next coming years is, are there other markers we can use to know how the roast is going? And one option is chemical markers. Maybe we can sniff specific molecules in the exhaust coming off the roaster that tell us where we are in the chemistry, where we are in the roasting process. Maybe color reading is going to become cheaper. Maybe it will become cheap enough to put into a sample roaster. And if you can do online color readings, then that really takes a lot of the guesswork out of ending a roast. And then I mentioned spectrographic markers. So the idea here is that, for example, by looking at the infrared spectrum of a coffee, you can target specific molecules and find out how much of them remain in the coffee during the roasting process. I mean, the easiest one is water. So water responds very well to infrared radiation. You can use an infrared spectrogram to see how much water is left in the coffee, and that can tell you how far along the roast you are. So these kind of technologies, they're well developed in other industry. There's some exploration within coffee, but I think the interesting challenge is, can we make this useful at a sample roasting scale? And if we can, maybe we can take yet another decision-making step away from human hands and just make that a bit easier for you. So making the process simpler by using this much more complex tool. And then there's another approach. So we're obviously not the only ones exploring this kind of sample roasting. And another really good example is what Link is doing, which is what I think of as basically an extended profile library. So with Link, you put in data about your coffee, you tell them the moisture, you tell them the size, and then they pick from their library of profiles, okay, this is the profile that worked well. And I think that's really smart. But the next logical step from that is what I'm really, really interested in, and that is modeling. Because if you use that data about the coffee, if you know the moisture and you know the size, and you also know about your machine, if you know about the roasting environment, if you have data from the machine about how the machine roasts, put those two things together, and you can build what people like to call a digital twin. So you can virtually see how your coffee is going to behave in the roaster. This is a draft model that a guy called Professor Stephen Abbott has built for us, basically just for fun. And we're just beginning to explore, okay, with the quality of data that we have, how accurately can we model the roasting process? And if you can measure it, if you can model it accurately, then maybe you don't even need to roast at all. So the idea here is, if your model is good, then instead of sharing profiles with the people that you're trying to communicate with the producers or with the traders that you're buying from, you can share roast outcomes. And then the model can tell you what you need to do to your profile to get identical results. Maybe it can also, if you have a good model of your sample roaster and your production roaster, then every time you sample roast, you're also getting information about how that coffee is going to behave in your production roaster. So your sample roasts become pilot roasts as well for your production. You can also use modeling to predict what sort of profile you should use to get the kind of outcome that you're looking for, and to translate profiles between different machines. And there's loads of applications for this, but one that I thought was interesting is using this information for blends. So at the green buying stage, if you know how a coffee is going to behave in the roaster, you can pick coffees not just by how they taste, but by if they will roast well together in a pre-roast blend. Or if you're blending post-roast, you can choose your profiles so that you get similar solubility without having to do any of the trial and error. And then you can solubility match in your blends without any of the work. So there's a lot of promise with modeling, and we're really only starting to scratch the surface. OK, so I want to go and make some slightly more specific predictions. And obviously, the first prediction is that I'm going to really develop my beard, and it's going to become a lot more magnificent. Some of this is maybe a little bit more contentious, but I think one of the things that I'm seeing is that people are talking less and less about cup score. And sample roasting is the kind of, your first thought about what sample roasting is for is to grade a coffee and to score it and to decide based on the score if I want to buy it. But the kinds of coffees that people are really interested in right now are not necessarily the ones that are actually scoring high, because the scoring system wasn't designed for these kinds of coffees. And also, customers maybe aren't that interested in the difference between an 86 and an 87-point coffee. They're interested in the rarity of a coffee. They're interested in having a big range of different things to try. And even the SCA, I think, is tacitly acknowledging this in the changes with the CVA. The scoring is the same, but they are explicitly acknowledging that there is value beyond the cup score. And so in this case, sample roasting then is less about green grading, and instead is more about answering the kind of questions about, should I buy this coffee? Because will it roast the way that I want it to? If I roast to this color, like I roast all my espressos to this color, will it still taste good? Because maybe it tasted good on the cupping table, but I need to know if it's going to taste good when I've roasted it a bit darker. Will this coffee roast well in the constraints of the roaster that I have? You know, in a traditional drum roaster, there are limits to how far you can push the profile. And so you need to know that if the coffee is actually going to behave itself in that kind of roaster. And when I roast this coffee, is this going to attract the kind of customers that I want in my shop? You know, and these are all a little bit different to quality decisions. And the quality of data is becoming more and more important. And so I think that data is going to trump cup score, because modeling, AI-assisted roasting, really green coffee analysis, all of these things lean on good quality data. And I think the more of this, the better our sensor technologies get, the more important that is going to become. And I think even sample roasting itself might be pushed out of some parts of the chain if we can replace sample roasting with an electronic nose. If you can measure the volatiles off a green coffee and identify defects without having to roast it, that saves a step, it saves coffee. So maybe sample roasting is going to come out of that step. It's something that is interesting for the future, but we've got a way to go. Another big trend that I see is this, this relates to the hyper-specialization, but we're finding that there are a lot more people aiming for top-tier quality in coffee, whether that's commercial, big commercial brands trying to move into specialty, or whether that is producers realizing that if they can aim a bit higher with their sample roast, if they can sample roast to the same kind of level that the coffee is being roasted here at the festival, then they have a better idea about the quality of what they're selling, and that gives them more power in negotiations. And I think more and more, we're seeing more and more producers becoming their own exporter, becoming their own importer. And so for the producers with the resources and with the money and with the time, they are able to, they are using the sample roaster as a tool to improve their bottom line by getting more power in their negotiations. And it's also, it closes the feedback loop between the seller and the buyer. If you've taken out the traders in the middle, you need to know that you're talking about the same thing, and good sample roasting data is key to that. But there is one caveat, which is that this only applies to the producers who have the money for it, and for most people making coffee, even the most basic sample roasting equipment is unfortunately still out of reach, and I think this is something that really needs to change. And I don't think we are going to be the ones to fix it, but I'm really hoping and there's a clear need in the market for somebody that can make this happen. Okay, my next prediction is that within specialty, people are going to get more and more interested in super fast roasting. And this is something we're starting to see already. So in the commercial sector, it's pretty common to roast your batch of coffee in 3 minutes. And for specialty, this was definitely unthinkable a few years ago, but it's becoming more and more common. With this kind of roast profile, you often are choosing a very minimal profile, maybe even just one single temperature the whole way through the roast, or maybe just a couple of changes. And instead of thinking about profiling as this tiny little detailed step-by-step process, you're really focusing on the outcome. So roast at this speed, and then drop the coffee at just the right moment, and you can still get amazing coffee. And this is only possible with fast convection roasters. So you need specific equipment to do this. You can't roast in 3 minutes in your Kobat, in your drum roaster. But it is possible to make amazing coffee this way. But the only way to do it is if your data quality is really, really good. Because in a 3-minute roast, the difference between under-roasted and over-roasted is very, very tight. So you need good decision-making about when that moment is. You need to be able to know exactly when it is and get it right every time, and that relies on your sensor data, and it relies on automation. But we're seeing this happen more and more. And if this trend becomes more common, the sample roasters need to catch up. If specialty roasters start roasting 3-minute roasts, they need sample roasters that can do 3-minute roasts. And there's not many of them. One of them's ours, by the way. OK. And another thing that I think is interesting is we're seeing people roasting in what I think it's fair to say, are quite strange and weird ways. People once you have a convection-based roaster, you're freed from the constraints of the kind of thermal energy of the drum, and it allows you to do profiles that really are not possible on other kinds of roasters. Now, I'm not saying that all of these are necessarily good, but people are exploring things that would have been unthinkable. And this is just one example off our Discord of a guy who's been trying out different things, and it's one of the strangest profiles I've ever seen. You know, he starts at medium heat, minimal airflow, and then suddenly switches to maximum airflow and drops the heat. And then he has this dip in airflow in the middle, and then it's wild. I have no idea if it tastes good or not. But it's something that you can't, a few years ago, it was just not possible to even explore. And maybe there is something to this, because he's not the only one that I've seen talking about multi-step roasting, about instead of just thinking about roast phases, but about actually explicitly separating the steps of roasting and applying heat in steps rather than as a single curve. And these things will shake out. Over time, people will try these things. Some of these ideas will turn out to be rubbish. Some of them will turn out to be gold. I don't know which is which. But this kind of grassroots approach, the guys on the forums tinkering in their homes with their super high precision sample roasters, may be the ones that are driving the next kind of level of innovation in production roasters. Because this is something we've seen in espresso, for example. A lot of the, Lance talks about this, a lot of the advances in how we brew espresso are coming out of home baristas who have the time and the patience to tinker with things that, as a barista, you just think, this makes no sense. But then actually some of those ideas turn out to be smart. And I think the same is going to happen with roasting. Maybe. I hope so. And then the other thing that we're seeing more and more of with sample roasting is that people are leaning on them for production. Or this applies to small-scale roasting more generally as well. But basically, when your roaster is good enough at giving you the same result, then the batch size kind of stops being relevant. OK, I am out of time. Woo! Oh, I'm on my last slide. OK, then I will wrap it up very quickly. But basically, what I'm saying here is, if your replication is perfect, it doesn't matter if you're roasting 100 grams or a kilo at a time, because you can let the machine take that work for you. So the takeaway from all this is that I think the role of the roaster is moving away from this idea about green quality towards decision quality. And I think that is the thing that is way more important. And over the next 5 years, the difference is going to be the guys that can make use of that data, make use of automation to free up their time and make better decisions. OK. Last thing before I leave you and let you guys go to taste some lovely coffee is that we are doing an event this afternoon at Dan Matteo. If you want to come and play with our newest toy, taste some coffee from our customers, please scan this QR code, register, come and try out our 3-kilo production roaster. It would be really, really lovely to see you there, and we'll have pizza and beer afterwards. And that is all from me. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a real pleasure to be here.